Yom Hazikaron Tafshin Pei Daled. Yom Hazikaron means the day of memory, remembrance. It's almost ironic that this year we have to remember anything. We are in the middle. Yesterday when the siren went off at 8 p.m., I don't think any of us needed to really scratch our minds to try and figure out to remember anything. It was forefront. The siren itself obviously triggers kids, triggers adults. At this point, we don't need to really remember anything. Zechor al tishkach, lo tishkach. Remember, don't forget. We're not going to forget so quickly. As part of everything that's gone on in the past 7 months, since the 7th of October, there have been many, many painful, mournful events that we've all been part of, we've all seen, we've all participated in, levayos and things like that. We're all part of this whole process, all of Am Yisrael together. Part of this process is also involved, and this is something that comes up in the news constantly, has also involved the really painful task of identifying who has died on the 7th of October and since then. And every so often in the news one hears, okay, they just declared that so-and-so from the 7th of October is actually a nifter, he's actually dead. The family can sit shiva. Very important thing. The family can actually mourn and have closure, unfortunately. And this whole process, this whole halachic process, which is going on behind the scenes, it's a halachic process and it's also a military process. It's all an intelligence process. There's actually a special beis din that's been set up for that. There's a special panel in the Rabbanut handled, managed, headed by Rav Yitzchak Yosef. So every time you hear in the news that someone was just declared a nifter, all the intelligence has gone through a set of dayanim, and Rav Yitzchak Yosef, who heads this panel, has declared that based on the proofs, based on the rayos, on the simanim, whatever it might be, this is all even as a siman yud zayin. Anyone who's interested in one of the most complicated simanim in Shulchan Aruch, they have declared that this person is now officially dead. And that's one of the complicated and really awful processes that everyone has to go through to declare someone who is nifter, especially with everything that went on the 7th of October, all the terrible things that happened to the niftarim. But there's been something else that's another halachic process that has started, and really it started beforehand, but really come to the forefront as a result of all the niftarim, as a result of all the chayalim, the young people who are niftar, a whole nother process, which one could really look at as almost like a ray of light, if one can say such a thing, within this whole tragedy. And that is the process of something that we can do nowadays that was never possible, which is that somebody who is niftar perhaps can have progeny, perhaps can have children after they're dead. It's a whole new process. How does this happen? How does this occur? So, within a certain time period, usually they say within 24 hours, of someone who is niftar, someone who was killed, it's possible to retrieve sperm, to retrieve zera from the niftar, and then using IVF for the person to conceive with his wife. Let's just assume that for a second. And then, possible, perhaps years later, for someone to have a baby. So one can retrieve the zera, one can freeze it, what's known as cryopreservation. One can freeze it, then one can go through IVF, and then, years later perhaps, his wife can now conceive and have a baby. And that's a very interesting discussion, which we're going to discuss this evening, a very complicated discussion. How does that work? How does that work? Is that halachically permissible? Is that something that is a good thing, a bad thing, a problematic thing? So there's many challenges and many halachic points in here that we're going to try to discuss today, this morning. And we're obviously not going to cover, as I always say in all our shiurim, we're not going to cover every tangent and every nuance. We're going to try and cover, in broad strokes, the main challenges and the main discussions on this. The Torah tells us, as we know in Parshas Kiteitzei, that someone who is nifter and doesn't have any children, there is a mitzvah of yibum. Ki yeshvu achim yachtav. Dvarim Perek Kafei. Pasuk K. Ki yeshvu achim yachtav. When two brothers are living together, and one of them dies, one of them is unfortunately nifter and he doesn't have any children. Lo siya Aish Sameis Chutza le'ish zar. She should not marry somebody else. Lechatchila yavama yavo aleha. Or lekacha lo le'isha v'yibma. She should undergo yibum. Her brother should marry her. Continues the Gemara. Continues the pasuk? Sorry. What's the reason for this? What's the point of this? V'hayaha bechor asher teilei. The first child that she now gives birth to, Yakum al shem achiv hameis. He should be there and to replace the shame of achiv hameis, of his nifter brother. In other words, it would be the child's uncle. He should replace him. V'lo yimachesh shmo mi Yisrael, and his name should not be forgotten. Yom Hazikaron. We are remembering. So this is a way of remembering, it seems the Torah tells us. The Yibum is a way of continuing the name of the nifter, continuing the memory of the nifter. What does that mean, continuing the memory of the nifter? Is there a mitzvah? Does he have to be called after the person? The answer is no. The Gemara says in Yevamos that the child of the brother who did the Yibum does not have to be called after his uncle, as it were, right? The nifter. It doesn't have to be called. So how is this a memory? How is this a memory? Interesting question. So the Gemara says he becomes the Yoresh. Well, he's not really the Yoresh either. He is the Yoresh of his father, who is the brother. So in what way exactly is this perpetuating the memory of the nifter? In what way? It's an interesting discussion. The Zohar Kodesh says that the child of the brother, the person who did Yibum, the child of the brother, he gets the neshama of the nifter. Okay. I don't know Kabbalah. That's what the Zohar Kodesh seems to say. What's the pshat though? In what way is this a memory for the deceased? It's not the deceased son. It's the deceased brother's son. So how is this a memory of the deceased? So the Sforno says, if you think about it, the reason why the brother is marrying the wife is only because the nifter married her. So in a way, he is continuing the marriage, the first marriage. He's continuing the first marriage, and this is a product of the continuance of the first marriage. Okay? Somehow, this is perpetuating the memory of the deceased. And this is the yesod that we see from Yibum. And it's not just a mitzvah in the Torah. We have it starting way before that. In Parshas Vayeshev, we have with Yehuda, Erva Onan. The Pasuk tells us the Onan was supposed to do Yibum, and he didn't want to. It seems this was a very early process, very early mitzvah, almost, it's not in Shiva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, but something that was done to perpetuate the memory of the mace. And it's not just in the Torah that we find this. We find this also in Sefer Rus. In Sefer Rus, Boaz wants to marry Rus, and the pasuk says Vayoma Boaz, and Boaz says to Ploni Almoni, B'yom knoscha asada miyad Naomi, u'me'eis Rus ha'moaviyah eshes hames kanisa lahakim shem hames al nacha laso. The purpose of this whole process transaction is to keep the memory of the deceased al nachalaso, on his nachla. So we see this whole idea in the Torah of perpetuating the memory of the mace. So if that's the case, what are the halachic ramifications? What are the halachic questions and answers to deal with our process? Our process is known as posthumous reproduction. That's the technical term, which means having a child, conceiving a child after death. The families want to do this. All the families want to do this. This is something that's happened a lot since October 7th. The last article I read about it mentioned that well over 100 families have already done this since October 7th, have already retrieved the zera from the deceased. And there's a whole legal process that has to happen in this country, and I'm sure in every other country. I don't know what it's like in the US, in the UK, but there's a whole legal process. So to get permission to retrieve, to get permission to use the zera in order to actually conceive, there is the Beit HaMishpat Elyon has a special process. You have to get permission and consent, which we'll discuss briefly in a second. So there's a whole process that goes on here. It's not a simple thing, and that's what we want to discuss today. The process and the challenges of the process. So number one, in order to retrieve the zera, one has to do something with the nifter. One obviously has to touch the body of the nifter. Is that something which is mutter? we have a concept in halacha which is well known called nivul hames. We have kavod hames. We have kavod for the nifter. A person is not supposed to desecrate, defile, if you want, the body of a nifter. A nifter, we do a tara, we clean the body, we bury it. The Chever Kadisha, as you all know, the Chever Kadisha usually asks mechila at the kever in case we didn't treat you with all. There's a whole level of kavod that we respect the nifter, we respect the body, and that means we don't do nivul hames. The Gemara tells us in many places you're not allowed to open a kever after the Gemara in Baba Basra Daf Kuf Nun Hey speaks about opening a kever to check whether the person who was nifter was a gadol or not, whether he was an adult or not. We're going to check. Are you allowed to do such a thing? The Gemara in Chulin Yudalef, which we'll discuss in a second, also discusses nivul hames, opening up a mace to check whether he was a treifa or not. We'll get to these in a second. There's a concept, though, you're not allowed to defile, just desecrate the body. So if that's the case, the process of retrieving the zera, is that nivul hames? Is that something which is even mutter? Are we allowed to touch the body in order to take something out in order to use it? So you'll tell me that we do transplants.
No, it's different.
1 second. You'll tell me you do transplants. So this whole discussion starts with transplants. There's a very famous discussion between the Binyan Tzion, the Tshuvas Binyan Tzion, Rav Yaakov Ettinger, the Aruch LaNer, and the Maram Shik, 150 years ago or so. And they were discussing this exact topic of taking out Aver min Hames. So this is talking about when Western medicine was actually starting to know what it was doing. It used to be that, we'll just be honest, Muslim medicine, Islamic medicine in the Middle Ages was much more advanced than Western Christian medicine, if you want. But then, obviously, in the past few hundred years, Western medicine has taken off. So the discussion between the Binyan Tzion and the Maram Shik, is one permitted to take out an organ from the nifter in order to save somebody else? Pikuach nefesh. Okay, I'm not going to go into that whole discussion, that's a shiur into itself. But the conclusion of the discussion basically is that if a person gives consent, if a person says, yes, I'm okay with you taking my organ, as it were, that's the conclusion of the Binyan Tzion, then it's mutter, it's permissible to take out the organ. Okay, so if a person gave... For mace. Why? So why is it... The mace gave consent before he died, obviously, yeah. If the mace gave consent, then one is permitted to take out organ. What is the discussion there? There the discussion is pikuach nefesh. There the discussion is to save someone's life. Is this extraction of zeras to save someone's life? Is pikuach nefesh? No. It's maybe to perpetuate a life, to create a new life, but it's definitely not pikuach nefesh. So what about here? Is it mutter to be menavel hames in order to extract, retrieve zera in order to be able for the almana or whoever it may be to now have a new child? Is that something which is mutter? So this whole concept of nivul hames, desecrating the body, is something that comes up in some very well-known topics, such as autopsies. Is it mutter to have an autopsy? Generally speaking, we know we do not allow autopsies. Autopsy is opening up the body in order to investigate certain things. We do not allow such a thing. That's nivul hames. That is what nivul hames is. But if one looks in the poskim, one sees there are exceptions to the rule. The Gemara in Chulin Daf Yudalef, which I mentioned before, discusses opening up a deceased person in order to check whether he's a treifa, to check whether he was going to die anyway. What's the reason for that? The reason for that would be that if I find out that he was a treifa who's going to die anyway, perhaps the person who killed him, this is someone who was murdered, perhaps the person who had killed him, we would be able to save, we would say, no, he's not chayiv misa. That's what the Gemara there discusses. The Gemara in Baba Basra Kuf Nun Hey, as we mentioned before, discusses opening up a kever to check whether a person is a gadol. Why do we care whether he's a gadol? In terms of Yerusha, various monetary, financial matters. That's what the Gemara in Baba Basra Kuf Nun Hey discusses. So there's a response of the Sholem Meshiv. The Sholem Meshiv says, the famous Galicia, one of the Gdolei HaPoskim of Galicia, the Sholem Meshiv. And he says the whole concept of nivul hames is as the words sound. Nivul hames. What's nivul hames? Desecrating the body. Nivul, something negative which we're doing. His question was, the question to him was asked, is one allowed to open up a kever in order to be matir and aguna. What does that mean? Something very relevant. We need to open up the kever. We don't know who's buried there. Is this the woman's husband or not? So let's open up the kever. These are shilas that come up regularly. Let's open up the kever, and maybe we can check DNA, dental records, whatever it might be, to identify the person who is in the kever, and then we can matir the wife. We can matir her so she won't be an aguna. So this was a question that was asked to the Sholem Eshev. Is it mutter to open up a kever to be matir and aguna? And he said, absolutely yes. Why? It's not nivul hames. Do you honestly think that the deceased, the someone who is nifter, would not want his wife to be mutter? Do you honestly think he wants his wife to be an aguna? Do you not think that it's for the betterment of the nifter, of the husband, that his wife would be mutter? Obviously, he's not around now. He cannot show us his decision. But surely any husband would want his wife to be mutter if chas v'shalom something like that happened. So argues the Sholem Eshev, this is something which is just like in Chulin Daf Yud Aleph. If we can save someone from being killed in Beis Din, that's something that we would want to do. If we were sudden financial matters, one is allowed to, not the family, but someone externally can check the kever. When it's not nivul hames, something that the mace would want, something that benefits the mace, then for sure that's not considered nivul hames, and therefore one is allowed to, as it were, desecrate. Again, it's not the right word in this case, but one is allowed to utilize to open up the body. Similarly, a very common question which comes up, unfortunately, if someone is murdered, someone's murdered, the police want to do an autopsy. Why do they want to do an autopsy? They want to be able to try and find the murderer. Is one allowed to, in such a situation where doing an autopsy might be able to identify the murderer, is one allowed to do an autopsy? Is that considered nivul hames? So the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg says, no, it's not nivul hames. One is allowed to do an autopsy in such a situation. Why? You're cutting up the person. Why is that mutter? Says the Tzitz Eliezer, surely, the mace would want justice to happen to the person who murdered him. Surely the mace has absolute consent to identify the person who killed him, to bring him to justice. So that's not nivul hames. That's something which is for the benefit of the mace. That's something the mace would want. So that's not nivul hames. So one can similarly argue in our situation that in order to extract the zera from the mace, in order to perpetuate his memory, surely that is for the mace's benefit. Surely that's something that the mace would consent to, and therefore perhaps there's no nivul hames. Clearly, when the mace actually gives consent in writing beforehand, which, by the way, a lot of the chayalim did, which a lot of people did. But definitely, when a mace gives consent beforehand, okay, that's clear consent. But even without that, one could argue when it's not explicit consent, but implicit, if you want, consent, that the mace would want such a thing. One could argue that that's not a problem. That's not nivul hames. It's for the benefit of the deceased. Furthermore, there's a tshuva of Rav Moshe, where Rav Moshe discusses whether one is allowed to, from a mace, take out with a syringe blood or something like that to test for genetic, to test whatever toxicity, whatever it might be, to test what happened to the mace, how he was nifter. Rav Moshe discusses this and says there's no nivul hames in such a situation, because nivul hames means doing something that is desecration of the body. Having injections, having blood taken is something that everyone does. It's something that all of us do regularly, hopefully. We all go for our blood work every so often. That's a normal thing. That's not considered nivul. It's considered normal procedure, normal medical procedure. Yeah. It means opening up the kever. So you're not actually defining the body, but the fact of opening the kever, there's definitely different types of nivul hames. Again, without going into all the details, there's definitely different types of nivul hames. Opening the kever versus actually opening up the body and things like that. Yes, but the Gemara there in Baba Basra discusses the concept of nivul hames as far as opening up the kever to check whether the nifter is a gadol or not. Yep. Okay, so that's as far as the concept of nivul hames. So if the person gave consent, there's no lichora, there's no nivul hames, and perhaps even if it's implied consent, that is also not Nevel HaMeis because it's for the benefit of the Meis, to perpetuate his memory. So that's as far as retrieving the Zera. The second concept that comes up after that is what's known as Hana min HaMeis. We know, the Gemara tells us in many places, that a person, a Meis, a Nifter, is Asur B'Hana. One is not allowed to derive benefit from a dead person. So if one is not allowed to derive benefit from a dead person, from a dead body, if that's the case, how do we do transplants? And the answer is Pikuach Nefesh. Pikuach Nefesh. For Pikuach Nefesh, one is allowed to do transplants. Okay, so one is allowed to get, just like anything else, besides for the big three, the Gimel Averos Chamuros, one is allowed to be over Isurim. One is allowed to be over these prohibitions. If that's the case, one is allowed to get Hanaf Ames for Pikuach Nefesh. Great. What about the situations where it's not Pikuach Nefesh? Is one allowed to get benefit from the mace for things which are not Pikuach Nefesh? This was a question which started a huge question where there's a very large amount of literature that all of you can obviously look up. I'm not going to go into in depth here when it came to the concept of a corneal transplant. Corneal transplant, which is something that came up, if I'm not mistaken, in the 60s, 70s, and this became a whole tumult in the poskim. Is one allowed to take the cornea from a deceased in order to transplant it in somebody who doesn't have good eyesight, to give them eyesight? Someone who's blind, to give them eyesight? Depending what the issue is, of course. To give them eyesight? We would say, Pikuach Nefesh, you're allowed to get Hana from the dead person. Is this Pikuach Nefesh to give someone eyesight? Is that Pikuach Nefesh? So what's that? So some poskim brought down maybe Summa Choshev Kameis. Maybe a blind person's like a dead person. Do we really treat a blind person like a dead person? Or is that more metaphorically? So that's 100%. Some poskim discuss that. Summa Choshev Kameis. Can we use that to be materit? This became a whole long discussion amongst poskim, and again, we're going to give the cliff notes here. And a couple of different svaras were given why it might be mutter. I'm not going to go into the maskana as far as corneal transplant. That's not the purpose today. But a couple of different svaras were given why it might be mutter. A very interesting idea was proposed by the chief rabbi at that time, Rav Unterman, the Ashkenazi chief rabbi Rav Unterman. Rav Unterman, who's a rav in Liverpool, by the way, also. He was very close. He learned in the Mir in Europe, and he was a tremendous Talmid Chacham, very close to Rav Chaim Ozer and many others. And he was a chief rabbi in Tel Aviv, and then became the chief rabbi in Israel. And Rav Unterman proposed the following. He said, if you take something from a dead person and you use it for some purpose, that's Hana min HaMeis. Okay. If you take something from a dead person and then you put it in a live person, what is the status of what you just took? It is now not part of a dead person anymore. It's part of a live person. So now, when the person actually gets benefit from it, is it part of a dead person? No, it's part of a live person. It's now become part of the live person. It's not considered anymore Hana min HaMeis. Novel idea. In other words, any transplant obviously we're transplanting to a live person. By definition, it might have come from a dead person. No one's getting Hana from it right now. When are they getting Hana from it? Once it's part of the life. Once the cornea is in the live person, now we can see, oh, wow, amazing. But now, this cornea is not part of a dead person anymore. It's a live person. It has transformed into not Hana min HaMeis, but Hana min HaChai. Tremendous chiddush. Furthermore, that's one svara that was given. Rav Avadia has a whole discussion on this in Yabia Omer, whether he accepts the svara or not. Another svara that was given is that the Isur of Hana min HaMeis, just like many other Isurim, is only that has a shiur. There's a minimum amount that has to be Hana min HaMeis. If you take something which is really, really tiny, maybe it's discussion, is it chatzi shiur or not? Perhaps it's not as prohibited. In our case, when we're talking about taking a zera, clearly we're talking about something pachos mikashir, something that's not even visible. So there are many svaras why this would not be an issue of Hana min HaMeis. It's something which is almost invisible that it came from the mace. Perhaps this is not an issue of Hana min HaMeis. Again, there are those who want to say this whole concept of conceiving from a mace is actually asur because of these reasons. But generally speaking, the consensus is this is not the case for the reasons we have given. So we've discussed nivel min hames, and we've discussed hana min hames. Are these really issues? The main discussion that I would like to discuss this evening is really, this morning is, gets confusing after a while, is what is the status of this child? What are we doing this for? Who does this child belong to? Who is this child? We have many different halachas that depend on the status of this child. First of all, Yerusha. Is this child who's going to be born after the chayal, after the deceased, after the person was nifter, is this his child? Would he be Yoreshim? Is he considered to be his child? For Yerusha. When we call him up to the Torah, are we going to say, Ploni ben hanifter? Or not?
That's an IVF question in general.
Is he a Yaso? Okay. Well, he is a Yaso. I mean, by definition, pretty much.
I'm saying. So you're not supposed to bring. Are you supposed to bring this?
Okay, we'll get to that in a second. If the nifter was a Kohen, is this child a Kohen? What is he? What is his status? Yes.
You draw a distinction if somebody was alive and died during pregnancy. Same idea.
We're going to get to that in a second. Okay. So.
Questions.
I'm saying it's all a halachic question ultimately, right? But the Torah seems to give a halachic method for having a zechira for the mace, right?
In terms of yibum, in that specific case, yeah.
Well, I'm saying that seems to be the way the Torah has given us to create a zechira. So
that's only when let's say the person had no children. Let's say a person had a child and the Amar wants to have another child now. I mean, Yibum is a very limited scenario. Yes.
Yeah, obviously that's a question, but I'm saying, but if the Torah prescribes a method for doing this, then who's to say that we should create methods that are not?
Okay, so let's get to that. So our question is really, what is the status of this child now? Because this is something obviously very new, something 30, 40 years old, something that wasn't able to be done beforehand. The whole concept of IVF is something which is very new. The first IVF, when I was growing up, I remember very clearly coming home from school one day and sitting in front of I'm not supposed to say this in the camera, sitting in front of a television. And we had a program in London called, I'm trying to remember the BBC, called John Craven's News Round, which was like a 5-minute kids thing every afternoon. So I sit in front of it, and they're speaking about a test tube baby. And I'm sitting there, I'm like, test tube? How did they squeeze a baby into it? I just couldn't figure it out. It took me years to figure out what they were talking about. This is 1980s, okay? So 1980s is when the first IVF child was born. We're talking about 40 years. This is the whole concept is 40 years old. So many halachic sfarim, articles, tshuvas have been written about this whole idea in general. But especially now, this idea of having a baby after the person was nifter, that's something which is very new. So how are we supposed to look at this child? How do we view this child? This discussion actually starts way before that, when, as you mentioned, the question of what is considered to be, when does a child have to be born to be considered a person's child? There's a tshuva of the Noda B'Yehuda. Noda B'Yehuda Cheskel Landau was asked the following question. The Gemara says in Yevamos that if a person is nifter, before they can do Yibum and Chalitza, you have to wait 90 days. Why do you have to wait 90 days? You have to wait 90 days to check whether the wife was pregnant or not. Right? 3 months, first trimester, you have to wait a trimester to see whether the wife is pregnant or not. If she's pregnant, then she doesn't need, and the baby, Mitzvah Hashem, is born healthy, then she doesn't need Yibum or Chalitza. If not, then she needs Yibum or Chalitza. Okay? So that means we see quite clearly from here, and the Gemara discusses this, Chalitza Smuberes, Yibum, okay. The Gemara in Yevamos, for all those who've learned Yevamos, but we see very clearly from here that pregnancy, even though the baby's not yet born when the person was nifter, but as long as the process has begun, that is considered the nifter's child. That's very clear. Okay, what happens to us Noda B'Yehuda? And the question was asked to him about somebody who was nifter immediately after he was with his wife, and then she gave birth 9 months later.
Boaz, same thing, right? Boaz.
Okay, right, I guess that's not the question of Noda B'Yehuda. Didn't ask Noda B'Yehuda, but yes. The question of the Behuda was somebody who was nifter, his wife gave birth, and he was with her immediately before he was nifter. Okay, immediately before he was nifter. So, anyone who knows biology knows that a woman will not get pregnant immediately. There's a process. Fertilization until the embryo embeds in the uterus. There's a whole process of pregnancy. So the Netiv Yehuda's question was, in the first 3 days, we generally in halacha, we assume, Gimel Yomim L'Klita, it takes 3 days, that's the halacha assumes, 3 days until there's actual pregnancy that embeds in the uterus. Okay, we're going to take that as 3 days. Okay, so if that's the case, when the person was nifter, the wife wasn't even pregnant yet. She wasn't even pregnant yet. Okay? So then the question of the Yehuda was, is this child his child for Yibum and Yerusha? We know that if she's pregnant, it's his child when he died. And we know that if he had a child when he was nifter, there's no Yibum or Chalitza. If she's pregnant, therefore there's no Yibum or Chalitza. But she's not pregnant yet. She's not technically pregnant yet. So says Netiv Yehuda, Lamaisa, the process is in place where she will be having a baby. So technically, you're right. There's no pregnancy yet. Technically, if you look, you won't see anything embedded in the uterus. There's no pregnancy yet. Okay, but at the end of the day, the natural process of having a baby is in process. Since that's the case, it's considered to be his child as far as Yerusha. As far as all the halachas, it's considered to be his child. Except for Yibum. It's not considered his child for Yibum, says Netiv Yehuda. Why is that? Because the pasuk says, Uvein ein lo. It's not yet considered the moment that defines, and this is where it gets hard to understand, the moment that defines whether a person has whether halach of Yibum applies is the moment of death. There has to be a pregnancy at the moment of death. That's what the Netiv Yehuda says. Uvein ein lo. There has to be a pregnancy at the moment of death for there to be no halacha of Yibum and Chalitza. So Netiv Yehuda comes up with a very interesting, and again, I'm giving here a bit of the shortened version, a very interesting distinction between all the halachos in the Torah and Yibum. Yibum is different. Yibum, there has to be a child, a pregnancy, an active pregnancy at the moment of death. If there isn't, then the woman is chayav Yibum and Chalitza.
So you could even say from that lashon that there has to actually be a baby having been born already.
Well, the Gemara says explicitly that's not the case. The Mishnah says explicitly that's not the case. We wait 3 months to see whether she's pregnant. You see, the pregnancy itself is.
The is going based on the lashon of the pasuk. Saying if you would take the lashon of the pasuk that literally, then Chazal wouldn't have said.
Okay, 100%. So this is.
You're committing an issur technically when you do Yibum.
Yes.
So to just be martyr something like this just kind of mind-blowing.
Okay, so this is what the Netiv Yehuda says. Netiv Yehuda makes a distinction between what is considered to be his child for everything else. Kohen, Aliyah, Yerusha, yes, it's his child, because the process was in place. But as far as Yibum, no. As far as Yibum, there has to be an active pregnancy at the moment of death, says Netiv Yehuda. And as you can probably imagine, the Achronim, who were very puzzled by this distinction, how can you differentiate and say that this is child for this and not his child for that? The Kerem Orah, who was a very famous Mefarish on Shas, the Kerem Orah writes, I don't understand this distinction. He brings proofs for this. Again, I'm not going to go into it. Why? But he says it doesn't make any sense. How can you differentiate? The whole concept of Yibum is what? That he doesn't have a Yoresh to replace him. So you're saying he has a Yoresh, but still the halacha of Yibum applies? That doesn't make any sense. If he's his child for this, he's his child for that. How can you differentiate between the two? So the Kerem Orah says he's a child, period. The pregnancy has, even though it hasn't technically begun, but the process has begun, this is his child. So we have a distinction between Yibum and other halachas in the Netiv Yehuda. We have the Kerem Orah who says it doesn't make any sense to differentiate. If the pregnancy is in process, the pregnancy is in process for everything. That is, however, only by the case which we mentioned, where the zera was already inside the woman. What about our situation? Our situation, nothing has happened before death. Nothing at all has happened before death. Surely in our situation, we would say There's nothing here. This is not his child. This is a position, and I would like to read to you, this is a position of Rav Shal Yisraeli. Shal Yisraeli was a dayan on the Beis Din HaGadol. He was the Gadol who set up Eretz Chemda. You might have heard of Eretz Chemda. He was the Nasi of Eretz Chemda. And he has tshuvas called Chavos Binyamin. And in that there's a tshuva, this is in Siman Kuf Zayin of Chavos Binyamin. He writes the following. I'm going to read it to you because it really, his lashon is very interesting. Kinei ra'iti biton hatzofeh. Bet you none of you know what hiton hatzofeh is. Maybe the older people. Okay, you know. It used to be that in Israel, every political party had its own newspaper. So Haaretz is one of the few that's still around. Yated, I guess Yated is still around, okay? But there used to be Davar, which was for, if I'm not mistaken, Mapam. Used to have the newspaper Davar, which shut down, Baruch Hashem. Then there used to be another newspaper, which was the Mizrahi's newspaper, which is Hatzofeh. So all of these, every political party would have its own newspaper because, you got to publish your take on the news. So, Ton HaTzofeh used to have lots of Divrei Torah and Ma'amarim and things like that. So, by the way, you see that he used to read the newspaper. Different topic. I've seen this psak halacha coming in, being brought down in the newspaper. And it says the following. Yeled sheyivaled mizera mukpa zakai lirushas habein. That if you have a baby that's born from cryopreserved, from frozen sperm, from frozen embryo, he is his child, even if he's born a long time afterwards. He's his child, and he gets a Yerusha.
What year is this, approximately?
That's a very good question. It doesn't say. It doesn't actually say. What year? I haven't looked up the article in Hatzofeh. Yeah, I don't know. So his conclusion, he quotes the newspaper article, and then he writes, Eini yodea mi hem shepasku kazot. I have absolutely no idea who these rabbanim are. And this is a major mistake. Tos bahora. No possibility to say such a thing. Even the Netiv Yehuda, the Kerem, all of them are saying, yes, it is his child. That's because there's a natural process of pregnancy in process.
In secular law, they go by DNA testing, which case it would be.
So leave out secular law for a second. The natural process is not happening. Without interference, without somebody actually going through IVF, there will be no pregnancy here. In our situation, how can you say this is mishtayech el hames? How can you say that this has a linkage to the deceased? Furthermore, he says, we know there are many halachos, if not all halachos, that totally terminate when the person's nifter. When a person's nifter, he is no longer married, for example. Can a person give a get can a get be given once a person is nifter? No. Ein get lachar misa. Once a person is nifter, the relationship of the marriage is gone. It's a famous question which is brought down in Poskim, which people love giving shiurim about. Aish Eliyahu. If Eliyahu Hanavi's wife, when Eliyahu Hanavi comes back, will she, theoretical question, obviously. When Eliyahu Hanavi comes back, will she still be married to him? Aish Eliyahu. He was nifter, or was he? Now she got. So it's clear that when a person's nifter, that relationship dissipates. It's clear when a person's nifter, he's not chayv in mitzvos anymore. Meisim chavshi. Person's not chayv in mitzvos once he's nifter. That's clear also. So how, if relationships are dissolving, how can you build a new relationship with a new child when you're nifter? You're not here. How can you have that relationship suddenly appear 5 years later? How does that happen? So says Rashal Yisraeli, that's not possible. A person who is born and i.e. the pregnancy was started after the person was nifter, there is no relationship between the new child that was born, Mazel Tov, the new child that was born, and the father. There is no relationship. Not for Yerusha, not for Yibum. Yes?
Does he differentiate if the zera was taken while they were still married and he was alive?
So that is some poskim discuss that. Is there a difference? Now, what's his tshuva? What is Rashol Yisraeli's tshuva? His tshuva is not dealing with our situation. His tshuva is dealing with a situation that is unfortunately not uncommon, where someone, a young adult, has to go through chemo. Okay? A young adult has to go through chemo. One of the things that is often done before chemo is for a woman to take eggs and freeze them, for a man to retrieve sperm and freeze them. So these are done because chemo obviously damages reproductive capability. So these are done beforehand. So this is where this question came up, not before, not our topic exactly, but beforehand. So this is the discussion. Yes, they retrieved it beforehand. It's not even from a mace, but it's being used after the person is nifter. So what is the status? So Rosh Yisrael says straight out, the status of this child is fatherless. He doesn't have a father. He's fatherless. There's no linkage. You can't build a new relationship as a father 5 years after your nifter. It's not shaykh. So the woman is chayav if she didn't have other children. The woman is chayav yibum or chalitza, and this is not his child. No, not for Yerusha, not for anything else. Okay? Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, however, in a response at Minchas Shlomo and a couple other places, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach had a different opinion. And he took the approach of the Netiv Yehuda. He took more the approach of the Netiv Yehuda. And he explains that as far as Yerusha, at the end of the day, this is his era. At the end of the day, this is his child. When it comes to Yerusha and every other halacha, we look at whether this is biologically his child. It is his child. It is his child. He was Nikral Shmo. He will get called up under his name. He'll be a Kohen. He'll get Yerusha. For all those halachas, it is his child. But when it comes to Yibum again, Yibum is different. Umeis ein lo. It has to be that there has a child at the time of death. 5 years later, this child is born. We're not going to retroactively say, oh, by the way, he had a child. No, at the moment of death, he didn't have a child. And if the moment of death, he doesn't have a child, this woman is chayiv in Yibum and Chalitza. So says Rav Shlomo Zalman, it is his child technically. But as far as Yibum and Chalitza, we're not going to retroactively say it was his child because the moment of death is the moment that determines whether a woman is chayiv in Yibum and Chalitza. So according to Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Zichrono Livracha, this child born from IVF, from cryopreservation, from the zera of the nifter, will be his child for every halacha. It just won't pater his mother from Yibum or Chalitza. So we have two different approaches here. Two very different approaches here. And this obviously begs the question, is this such a great idea then? It's really complicated. Who is the father? You know, there are many sugyas when we deal with IVF, when we deal with reproductive shilas, there are many sugyas of who's the mother. Donor eggs, who's the mother? Surrogacy, who's the mother? Here, the question is, who's the father? I know there's a famous joke. Okay, we're not going to go there. Who's the father? Is there a father? Perhaps this person is fatherless. Rosh Sternbuch, Shlita, in Shuras Van Hagos also takes the approach of a Shali Israeli, that there is no father here. There is no person here. And therefore he says he doesn't think this is something that should be done. Why are we bringing a child into this world without a father? He defines it as pogum. This child now, poor guy or girl, this child is fatherless. Why are we lechatchila doing such a thing? It's pogum. Why would we do that? He's taking again the approach that there is no father. This is a strong argument. Not only halachic argument, but also a psychological argument, a emotional argument. You're bringing a child into the world without a father. Lechatchila. Should you do such a thing? I think that's something, you mentioned that? Yeah. That's one argument which is brought down. Another argument against this whole process is brought down by Rav Zilberstein. Rav Zilberstein in his Shiur Torah L'Rofim argues that this shouldn't be done for another reason. The Gemara in Yevamos Daf Kaf Daled, it's a Mishnah actually, but the Gemara discusses it. The Mishnah speaks about somebody who is someone who people have suspicions that he's fooling around with somebody. Hanitan ala shivcha v'nishtachra, ola ha'ovedes k'chavim v'nisgaira. Someone who the shmua saw that this person is messing around with this goysha girl, and then she becomes a gioris. The Gemara says, Harizeh lo yiknos, he shouldn't marry her. Even after she becomes a gioris, he shouldn't marry her. Why not? Why shouldn't he marry her? So the Gemara says, because this is, what does that tell people? That tells people that the shmua beforehand that he was messing around was true. Says the Gemara, the Amar Avasi, Haser mimcha ikshus peh ulezus vasayim. Don't do things that ma'oreh chashad. A person should be very careful not to do things that look iffy and suspicious. Says Zilberstein. This woman, her husband was nifter 5 years ago, and now suddenly she comes out with a baby.
It's happening a lot nowadays, by the way. Not in that same context, but I'm saying people.
100%. Of course, it's happening a lot nowadays. In the United States, over 50% of babies are born out of wedlock.
And I'm not
But
even saying wedlock. I'm saying there are from women who are much older and they haven't had children.
agreed. Different topic. 100%. Says Zilberstein, should we lechatchila do such a thing which is going to pose many questions? What's going on here? Where did this baby come from? What's going on behind the scenes? Should we put this woman in that position? Says Zilberstein, perhaps we shouldn't do such a thing. Question mark. And there are many other arguments against the chatchila appropriateness of such a thing. But at the end of the day, Zalman Nechemia Goldberg, Zichron Livracha. And how many of you were zochet to hear shiurim from Zalman Nechemia? He was only nifter 4 years ago during COVID. He was nifter. Son-in-law of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Zichron Livracha. So Zalman Nechemia writes in a tshuva. He was asked this question. He said, we can learn something from Yibum. What can we learn from Yibum? The importance of a person having a zecher. So even if it's the case that there are not such great lechatchila things involved, maybe people as chashad. One can argue, as you said, nowadays. One can argue nowadays that there's not such a chashad. People know her husband was nifter. People know that there's such a thing. Perhaps there's not such a chashad nowadays. Yeah, it's true. This kid is going to be born without a father, potentially, according to you. Okay, but he has a mother, he has a family behind him. People know what happened. He was a kadosh, he was someone who was killed in our case, someone who was killed al Kiddush Hashem. People know. So perhaps that's not such an issue. The end of the day, says Zalman Nechemia, there's a tremendous chesed that we are doing with the nifter to continue, even if it's technically not his zera. Zalman Nechemia holds it is his zera, it is child. But even if it's not, it's still for the family, it's continuing the remembrance, the memory of the nifter. It's giving him a schus. We do many things, which even though the mace can't have a mitzvah after he's nifter, we do many things to be zocher, to be mezaker, niftarim. We say kaddish. How does that help? It's the schus of the nifter. The person's nifter, he can't do mitzvos. It's the schus of the nifter. We do mitzvos, the schus nifter. We do many things. We dedicate mitzvos, the schus of the nifter. This is the schus of the nifter, that he should have a child continuing. Technically, is his child or not? Question mark. Rav Zalman Nechemia says that b'chozat, it's gemilas chasadim for the mace. If he wants it, if he decided, he gave consent to it, that's what Rav Zalman Nechemia is talking about, it's something which is for his schus. And therefore, even though there are question marks around it, it's something which is absolutely mutter as long as he either gave consent or implied consent, meaning it's pretty clear that he would have wanted such a thing. That is the opinion of Rav Zalman Nechemia. We've seen now many different question marks regarding this whole process of having a child post-mortem. Many different questions. Nivel hames, in order to retrieve the sperm. Hana min hames, consent. We discussed that the court system here requires consent, either explicit consent from the nifter or from his almana. If he didn't give explicit consent, I'm not going to go into that right now. And the secular courts allow even consent from the parents if the person is not married. In halacha, that would not be permissible. Definitely, if the person himself gave consent, that would be, or implied consent, that would be okay. But we need some sort of level of consent. And finally, we discussed, what is the status of this child? Is this really his child? And we saw there's a very big machlokas here between the poskim. Many poskim say it's not his child. You can't have a child 5 years after your death and call that your child. You can't build a new relationship at that point. It's not your child for any halacha. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Zichron Livracha, and Zalman Nechemia, and many others hold no. It is your child for every halacha aside from Yibum. Yibum and Chalitza, that is defined based on the moment of death. If the baby was not conceived at that point, then there is no baby, and therefore there is Yibum and Chalitza. This is a very complicated topic, which is happening as we talk. These discussions are happening as we talk. These things are happening as we talk. Again, I mentioned to you that I read an article in February, and in that article they had said that well over 100 families had already undergone at least the retrieval, you only have 24 hours after the niftar. They say maximum 72 hours, but really 24 hours. So it's something, the retrieval has to happen immediately. There's no time for shilas at that point. Not really much time for shilas at that point. But as far as the usage, that you need a court order in this country. Halachically, as we said, it's a question mark as to the permissibility of it, a question mark what the status of it is, and whether is warranted as something which is lechatchila. Unfortunately, not everyone has a zeicher. Unfortunately, out of the niftarim, not everyone has a zeicher. Not everyone will have progeny even through this process. And there are many people who don't have a zeicher as children. But the Navi Yeshayahu, as we read in the Hatorah, tells us that even a person who technically doesn't have children, doesn't have a zeicher, but they do have a zeicher. The pasuk says, Yeshayahu Perk Nun Hey, V'al Yomar Ben Hanichar. A foreign person, Hanilvai Hashem Limora, a ger, shouldn't say, Havdel Yavdi Lani Hashem Me'alamo. Hashem will not treat me properly. V'al Yomar Hasaris, and a person who is not able to have children shouldn't say, Hey Nani Eitzi Yavesh. What am I? I don't have any continuation. I don't have anything going for me. I'm saris. I don't have any children. Ki cho amar Hashem, lasarisim asher yishmuru shab sosayu v'charu b'asher chafatzti u'machzikim b'vrisi. V'nasati lahem b'veisiu v'chomasai yad v'Hashem. These people who don't have a zeicher, they don't have children, unfortunately. But I will give them a yad v'Hashem, tov mi banim u'banos, greater, a zikaron, a remembrance, greater than children. Shem olam et ano asher lo yikares. They will have a memory that will not be cut off. And so, when we're speaking about Yom HaZikaron, the people who, as we discussed today, maybe could still have children, unbelievably, with modern technology, with all the shilos and questions involved. The vast majority do not. But at the end of the day, hopefully the shiur was, the Zichron was in the memory of all the Chalalim, all the Kedoshim. They still have a Zikaron. We are the Zikaron. We perpetuate their memory. We remember the Kedoshim and all the people who are Moshe Nefesh, to Klal Yisrael, for us, for our families. Shem Olam Eten Lo Asher Lo Yikares, and their memory will never cease.